Words. That's my job. Speaking words, writing words, talking about the world around us, trying to make sense of events, injustices, horrors in accordance with my principle. That's my job. I do these videos. I try and sketch out before what to say, but it becomes harder and harder because one of the great crimes of our age, Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, is happening every day before us, every day, live streamed to us on our phones, on our computers. One of the great crimes of our age, as I say. New horrors, new atrocities, new crimes, yet most of our political and media establishments are complicit. And they could stop this, but they don't. And instead they try and portray those of us who oppose this slaughter, whose horror will scream down the ages as being the real extremists who need to be silenced. It's enough sometimes to make you feel like you're going mad. But we can't do that. And we owe it to the people of Gaza to keep speaking and to keep using our words. Today, the Israeli army massacred desperate, starving Palestinians as they tried to get flour from aid trucks to feed their loved ones or those loved ones who have survived. It's believed that well over 100, maybe 150, maybe more were killed and many hundreds wounded. Here's what happened. Gaza is starving to death, as I'll explain, because the Israeli state is deliberately starving its people to death. Israel has blocked humanitarian aid getting into northern Gaza since the 23rd of January. Today, as some aid trucks containing flour arrived, Israeli tanks and drones started shooting at people who were desperately trying to get some food, some flour for their families. And then, of course, those who survived, or those who weren't shot and killed, began to flee. According to Al Jazeera, Israeli tanks advanced and ran over many of the dead and injured bodies. Ambulances couldn't reach the area, so the dead and injured were carried on trucks, taken to hospitals which are barely functioning, lacking fuel, medicine, they have no blood. The IDF then thrashed around trying to invent reasons for what had happened. Here's three of them.
There's three different explanations we're hearing from the IDF so far. Initially, it was that there was a stampede that caused loads of people to die. Then there was a suggestion that a truck had actually, driven by a civilian driver, had mown down a load of the Palestinians. Then there was a suggestion that this was potentially Hamas stealing the aid.
The IDF originally denied shooting at civilians at all, claimed it was a stampede. It was now obviously became impossible to justify, given the wounds of the dead and injured were clearly caused by ammunition. So they then issued a statement claiming that those starving Palestinians constituted a violent gathering, which made soldiers feel unsafe as they indiscriminately opened fire on them. Now, to be clear, their claim that they felt threatened was about being threatened by starving, desperate, emaciated Palestinians. Multiple sources and eyewitness reports said the Israeli troops started the firing, and indeed I watched the videos where you can quite clearly hear Palestinians fleeing, shots ringing through the air. I'd share them, but unfortunately YouTube has a habit of age-restricting videos with that kind of footage and thus collapsing their audiences, and of course I'm trying to reach as many people as I can. As the courageous Israeli human rights organisation B'Tselem report, the residents of Gaza are starving due to the humanitarian crisis Israel has intentionally created in the Gaza Strip. Their attempts to access the scarce aid allowed in led this morning to the deaths of dozens of people after soldiers fired into the crowd. Whether they were shot or trampled to death, intentionally opening fire at civilians is a severe violation of international law and constitutes a war crime. This is especially grave given a crowd of thousands begging for aid. This has become known as the Flour Massacre. Say those two words aloud. Flour Massacre. A massacre of Palestinian civilians trying to get flour for their families. Now, Israel has starved these people. And as those few aid trucks with some flour arrived, they massacred them as they tried to feed themselves and their families. Why is this happening? Because the Israeli state know they can get away with anything. Listen to the Israeli National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Here's how he responded to this mass slaughter of innocent people. I'll quote, "Total support must be given to our heroic fighters operating in Gaza who acted excellently against the Gazan mob that tried to harm them. Today it was proven that the transfer of humanitarian aid to Gaza is not only madness while our abductees are being held in the strip under substandard conditions, but also endangers the IDF soldiers. This is another clear reason why we must stop transferring this aid, which is in fact aid to harm the IDF soldiers and oxygen to Hamas." That's quite right, what you've just listened to there. That's correct in terms of a translation. You're not being deceived. Your ears aren't deceiving you. That's what he said. Israel has prevented food from getting into Gaza, starved its people, and then when it massacres some of those desperate people, Israel's equivalent of their Home Secretary, he didn't just admit it, he celebrated it, he rejoiced, and then he said this shows all aid should be stopped from getting into Gaza altogether. Now in Israel, Telegram groups are ecstatic. Here's one example. First footage of the blessed massacre. You can see clearly they're fighting for their lives, for survival. Cannibalism is on the way. We must starve them until the long-awaited cannibalism. Do you ever wondered what happens when a society is overwhelmed by genocidal mania? Well, now you know. As Belgium's Deputy Prime Minister has tweeted, horrified by the news of today's massacre of over 100 Palestinian citizens, murdering people queuing for essential humanitarian aid. This is a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and goes fully against the ICJ's provisional measures. Indeed, you can only conclude this is part of Israel's genocidal strategy. Massacre those looking for food and you will deter them from doing so in future. Here's the context. Famine. Famine which is deliberate and calculated. Listen to this from Melanie Ward, the CEO of Medical Aid for Palestine, and I warn you, it's grim.
Just explain first to our viewers why aid isn't being allowed in. Where is the aid?
It's very simple. It's because the Israeli military won't let it in. We could end this starvation tomorrow very simply if they would just let us have access to people there, but it's not being allowed. This is what they said on the 7th of October. Nothing will go in, and so it remains the case. And for people in the north of Gaza, it's even worse because no food is reaching them anymore. And so my own staff, my own colleague Abir, has been eating animal feed. And horrifyingly, the food that they were eating, which is food for horse and donkeys, is now running out, and now they're eating birdseed. The statistics also tell their own story. 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 in the north of Gaza are now acutely malnourished. This is the fastest decline in a population's nutrition status ever recorded, and what that means is that children are being starved at the fastest rate the world has ever seen. And we could finish it tomorrow. We could save them all, but we're not being able to.
Process that for a moment. I'll repeat. This is the fastest decline in a population's nutrition status ever recorded. That means children are being starved at the fastest rate the world has ever seen. Are those complicit in this? Not just by actively supporting this, by which point anyone in that camp should be judged as beyond depraved, but those who are silent, are they not feeling any shame listening to those words? I would die of shame myself. Keep reminding yourselves this is all deliberate, what you're hearing, this humanitarian calamity. Indeed, a quarter of Gaza's population are one step from famine, while 1 in 6 children under 2 are suffering from acute malnutrition and wasting. That's where the body becomes emaciated. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, this is deliberate starvation by Israel and thus is genocidal. And yet you have the White House now examining options to begin airdropping food into Gaza, instead of using that actual leverage over their key ally, which is completely dependent on them to get aid in. Now, finally, just listen to this.
The head of the Pentagon, who says that over 25,000 women and children have been killed in Gaza since the Hamas attacks on Israel on the 7th of October. You'll remember that the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry announced today that over 30,000 people have been killed in Gaza since the 7th of October attacks. Well, the Pentagon now saying that 25,000 women and children are known to have been killed.
Ever since this horror began, we have heard non-stop atrocity denial. That the official numbers, or the number who've been slaughtered in Gaza, are a lie, a deceit. We can't trust the Hamas-run health ministry. And they keep blazing that, don't they? Hamas-run health ministry, Hamas health ministry, so you don't believe what they say. Even though all the figures, the death figures in previous conflict released by that ministry have been correct. Even though earlier on in this horror, they released all the names and details and Israel-assigned IDs of the dead to prove they were in fact dead. Even though the prestigious Lancet medical journal confirmed the figures as accurate, even though aid agencies on the ground keep confirming these figures, even though the official deaths figures of more than 30,000 killed is a drastic underestimate, because it excludes those buried under the rubble. Many thousands were classed as missing, even though most are long dead and may never be identified. Even though the hospitals have ceased functioning and society has collapsed so much that many deaths are not being reported, even though only violent deaths are reported and included in those figures, not those, for example, starving to death or dying of preventable medical conditions. Now, the Pentagon's saying 25,000 women and children killed. That excludes the men who were innocent. Many thousands of men are innocent. Just because you're a man over 18 doesn't mean you are competent. And a new study has found that by August, on the current trajectory, 1 in 20 of the entire population will have been killed. This is one of the great atrocities of our time. You've read in the history books about other atrocities, and you were shocked, I hope, when you read about them. You're living through one now, and you can see how they happen and how so many become actively complicit. And I know what's going to happen. So obvious what's going to happen, isn't it? In years to come, nobody will admit that they supported the massacre of Gaza and this atrocity. And those who were silent will claim that they actually spoke out. But we know different, don't we? We know different. So few spoke out, and so many were silent, and so many actively supported this horror, even though it was clear from the very beginning, based on what Israeli leaders and officials said what they were going to do. No excuses. So we've got to keep speaking out. Those who did this and continue to do this mustn't be able to get away with it. They have to be held to account. Because otherwise, if this is allowed to happen, this massacre, this genocide, and there's no accountability, then we might as well all give up. Because any horror will be possible after this, and far worse will be to come. Please like and subscribe. Share this on this video or podcast, however you listen to it. I'll speak to you soon.